Thank you guys for coming. Before I get started, I just wanted to do a quick, how many of you guys are in GA? Or, okay, just a few. How many are you in startups right now? How many are thinking of going to startups? Okay, and how many of you are journalists or come from media companies? Okay. All right, great, thank you. So what I thought I would do is spend a little bit of time talking about the landscape of publishing and sort of just the perspectives that I've seen and thoughts on that, and then talk about specific things related to how to make websites that create change. Before I get started, I wanted to talk about that there's definitely different types of change, and it's enormous, and so I wanted us to break it down to the part of it, the little tiny part of it, that I'm going to focus on and that this sort of talk is about. So when you think about building tech startups, there's things that are become fundamentally important technologies that are very simple. So it's Twitter, Instagram is the best example probably, is that it has to remain simple and have very little depth in its feature set, et cetera, to be the enormously successful platform that has created tremendous amount of change. That type of stuff I'm not going to cover so much. I'm thinking much more about the way people reach audiences, the way people create websites and apps and create content and communities, and what's happening to that publishing landscape, how are companies affected, how are movements affected, et cetera. So I think that for me, so first, if I was CTO of Huffington Post for year one to a year after acquisition, I ran product design and engineering there, and there are a lot of lessons learned. I love that what we're doing at Rebel Mouse. For me, what I felt is that people needed a very social CMS that was powerful and that was constantly tuning, instead of a paradigm of install this software and go do a lot of work. The metaphor and the thesis that we believe in, I think I can attribute to Ken Lear, who has a great metaphor that in the 80s, if you were smart about content, you would start a cable channel, because the cable companies had all of this audience waiting, and you could develop a voice, create this content, and build a very big business. I believe that and our thesis is that this is true now with the social networks. And people who understand how to write and build content and content experiences and community aimed at tapping the traffic that's coming from these networks, which does include Google. When you think about Gmail, is a very important source of sharing too. And so I was just talking to an investor recently who, it's mind-boggling how quickly the media landscape is changing. The numbers that people are seeing in terms of growth, we'll talk about it with the Dodo, but in 3 months from launch, it had reached 7.5 million uniques. That took us more or less 2 years, 2 years to do at Huffington Post. And it's, someone needs to write, Moore's Law is about the speed of processors doubling. Someone needs to write the law of growth of audiences and the potential, how quickly you can grow an audience, because we're seeing numbers that nobody's seen before. Like having 10 million people 5 years ago was actually far more meaningful as a business than having 10 million now is. So investors and brands and media companies, when you start to try to monetize the 10 million uniques, are exhausted by how many people are building these. And it's an interesting thing that's happening, which is really, I think the breakdown in the democratization and the fragmentation of where we go to consume stuff. And the thing that I find very uplifting about this is that it seems, and maybe I'm sure I'm being overly optimistic, so I'm sorry. But I feel like there's enough evidence for me to cling on desperately to that optimism, that like an era of apathy is kind of vanishing. And what people are clicking to is the stuff that asks them to be part of things that are meaningful. And so outside of what we've done with Rebel Mouse, et cetera, I think you look at Policy Mike as a great example of people actually wanting not to be talked down to because they're younger. And I think that what we're seeing with the explosion of Oz.org, which has like 38 million active members now globally, and Change.org's numbers are insane. Also, at the same time, we're seeing that it's possible to have very huge businesses like BuzzFeed grow, 5 times in traffic when it was already at a large scale in extremely short amounts of time. And another example, everyone's seen a lot about Upworthy, but Elite Daily is just like a shocking story of raising very little money and growing to 60 million uniques. And so when you think, so I'd love someone, I want to repeat it again quickly, I'd love someone to go coin the new Moore's Law thing, that every year you should be able to grow to the new huge peak X faster than before. And I think it's a threat to all the platforms because a Snapchat is going to happen even faster next time to everybody, including the platforms. But it means it's an awesome opportunity to create something meaningful that is really trying to get people to do stuff. Because what I found really interesting when you dig into the Elite Daily story and why is it growing, a big piece of it seems to be that they treat contributing writers with a lot of respect. They give them a lot of intellectual energy and time, and they don't feel snobby about how they do it. And so apparently the writers that are contributing there, though they're being paid nothing, feel like they're getting something from that exchange still. And so what I've found when we get into sort of how do you do these things, the overriding point that I wanted to be sure, the one thing that I'm pretty sure of is that to do it now, build these things, you have to have a voice. And that voice has to be really clear and easy to hold on to. So I really love the dodo. It's kind of a risky name. Like if it doesn't work out, it's so easy to make fun of. But you can see it's about the plight of animals. Very quickly you can grip onto that. And so how do you know if you have a voice is something that I realized is there's a way that maybe I'm stretching it here, but I think there's a sort of a way to measure this. And so like a long time ago in grad school when I met Jonah Peretti, for a class he was teaching on contagious media, I did a project with a friend called Dog Island. And I feel like I learned stuff from doing Dog Island that are still very relevant. So very quickly, Dog Island was a hoax site that pretended to be a place that you would send your dogs to live forever. And so we did a lot of little iterative testing, and so we first had it really dirt style, like they didn't have much money, but they were doing this. But we realized in testing that a beautiful, gorgeous site that looks like they have a lot of money and they're doing it is actually even more incredible to look. And so the action is send your dog to the island, And there were little things that I want to tie back, like so how we got distribution going on it, but also depth of story stuff. So it pretended to be very real, and the way that we launched it was that on Craigslist we picked 4 demographics that we felt that from each of those demographics that should spread in their own networks. So we posted apartments. So one was in Williamsburg, and we thought we'll get the hipsters from that. And one was in the Upper East Side, and one was in the Village, and it might have been just 3, maybe there was one in Soho. But they were all like pretty awesome apartments at a good deal, not unbelievable, but like, oh, maybe I found my apartment moment. And then, but they said very clearly, but to get the apartment, you have to visit this site. And there we had created a fictional character called Linda Reyes, who had a Dancing Kitties sort of GeoCities site. It was really ugly, and the font we used was like, I don't know, like 75 in the font size thing, so it's huge. And it said you have to, in order to apply for the apartment, you have to read the rules first. And the rules were 1, you have to own a dog, and 2, you have to bring the dog to see the apartment, and 3, if you choose the apartment, it has to go to Dog Island with a link. And those 3 posts on Craigslist was all we needed for that thing to go. And so I think when you think about how content spreads, that's the goal, is that like it just takes a few people, and then, you know, MIT did a thing that researches why do we share, and I think it's kind of like all true, but a little boring. And so it's, we share to show we're in the know, and we share for collective identity and to strengthen bonds. And I think those things are all true. But sometimes the more important reason we share is because we've seen something, and like there's something very human about having to share something. So to exaggerate it, and I'm not suggesting everyone goes and makes sour milk, but when you smell it like horrible sour milk, the instinct, if someone's near you, is to say, smell this thing. Even though it's horrible, it's just like you can't move on to your next thing until you turn to someone and say, did you see this thing? And so I think that's a factor that is underestimated when people think about why you share. And so with Dog Island, what we did is we started to build depth into the story of it. So as people researched to it, there were like, we put a lot into the site. It was beautiful. There were a lot of photos of dogs on the island. And so it was like all these dogs on the beaches. And we had a newsletter. So we're like, we just released rabbits. And we would reply to every email. Like thousands of people wanted to send their dog. And so this gets into this quadrants of, I don't know, like quadrants, like the viral quadrants maybe, but what it is it's love and hate and belief and non-belief. And when you have a really strong voice, then people are going to fall really clearly. And the stronger your voice is, maybe even the farther and more extreme they fall into it. So there was a group of people who believed Dog Island was real, and they loved it. And they would actually like, this is the right place for my dog. We did a lot of like blog posts about how dogs are treated like slaves, and they're put in collars, and their reproduction is restricted, and we're being cruel. And so we added all this like stuff for people who would identify with that to really go for it. And so they would like send us photos of their dog, and we would reply, and no matter what the dog was, it wouldn't be right for the island, you know? So like one, they did photos with it had red eye in the, and we were like, oh my God, it looks so evil, please don't send it to us. But so we had sort of fun with people, and then they would like, if they hadn't yet gotten that moment of I have to tell someone, when the employees of Dog Island would reply to their email, like then it happened. Like then they had to go tell everyone what was happening. But we built depth in it too for you to believe it and hate it, which was pretty easy to do. The idea was kind of crazy. But we went to some extreme, like DNS, we registered to Han Fei and Zhao Min. And if you Google them, they own a dog meat factory in Korea. And so there were people who actually believed it was true, and that either it was sinister and we were killing the dogs, or that it was just reckless and this is not how dogs should live and how can you be doing this? But either way of those categories, they were spending crazy amount of times on forums, on blogs, everywhere, telling, like some people saying, we will shut you down, like that's all we'll do. And then on the non-belief side, there were people who didn't believe it was true and loved it. And obviously those are easy people to relate to because they're like, dude, this is so hilarious. And they send it to everybody and they know it's a hoax, but they love it anyway. And so ton of that. We got interesting things like a bunch of foreign papers. It was triggered by a big paper in Australia where thematically they were like, these crazy Americans, look what they've done. And they printed it like it was totally true. But then there were people who knew it was not true, that it was a hoax, and still really didn't like it. So a friend at grad school came to me and was like, you have to shut it down. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, all that stuff is like, it's so much guilt, and like my wife isn't sleeping well, and it's so mean what you're doing to dog owners. And so for a while I've thought with Dog Island that relates more to hoaxes, this love and hate and belief and not belief. But I've been realizing that whatever you do in this narrow bucket of content and people reacting to content that is being created by you or being a community of content stuff, it absolutely applies. So it was in my face the whole time with HuffPost. But you would believe in us or not. Like there were people who in the early years thought we were just a silly little blog that would go away. Like there was nothing of substance to this. This was just ridiculous to talk about. And so they didn't believe in it. And sometimes they were like, they didn't believe it would be big, but they loved it. They're like, oh, well, I'm there all the time. Or, they didn't believe it was big and it was a symbol of things they hated. But also, somebody at CJR did a really long form, awesome post. And in interviewing and talking with him, it was funny that he said he was at a dinner and it was filled with New York Times and legacy media, super elites, and the word Huffington Post was like Voldemort at the party. Like everyone just went silent, and it was like, you fucked up the party. Like we weren't going to talk about that. And so I think that I think it's really good to sort of look for signs of people who believe in this, that this is huge. Like I think that when you think of the mission that Dodo's on, their numbers are amazing, but really it should be like 15, like so many people care about animals. It should be like 50, 100 million people on the site. And below that is like everyone's just driving like crazy to find it because it has to be there. So many people care about animals.